Welcome to ThinkTech on OC16, Hawaii's weekly newscast on things that matter to tech and to Hawaii. I'm Noe Au.
And I'm Richard Melendez.
In our show this time, we'll cover remarks made at the Plaza Club by Manny Menedez, Hawaii businessman doing business in China.
Menendez shared some very interesting facts and stories on how Hawaii entrepreneurs can better understand modern China and be better prepared to make successful deals there.
Manny was Economic Development Director for the city and county, but he is also a serial entrepreneur and business veteran in China and has been shuttling back and forth and doing business in China and Asia Pacific for 35 years.
He is founder, chair, and CEO of MCM Group Holdings Limited, which specializes in international business development, trade, and investment focused on Asia Pacific and China.
Manny is familiar with the customary difficulties of doing business in China. These days, China has experienced undeniable economic disruptions, including, for example, the devaluation of its currency and the fall of its stock market. Manny has followed these events since they represent new risks and perhaps also new opportunities in doing business in China.
Manny was in town 2 weeks ago and gave talks on China at multiple events, in a talk show at ThinkTech, at a Chaminade University gathering at the Pacific Club, and last week he spoke at the Plaza Club.
Here are portions of our ThinkTech talk show with Manny.
You really are devoted to China. I mean, more I see you, the more I see the devotion. You are dedicating, your whole life to China, everything. It's all in for China. Why?
Well, I think when I started going to China, my first trip was when China opened the door in 1979, officially. And I just saw this tremendous potential. I mean, China, as the world knows, has have a 5,000-year-old civilization, and I was attracted to that. And I saw the type of activity that they were doing at that time with actually no modern tools, nothing, and they were still churning ahead. So it excited me, and I started manufacturing things and doing deals there starting in 1979, 1980, when I was just a child.
So for us all.
Yes, and I've been always attracted to the Asia-Pacific region. China's been kind of the crown jewel, but I've worked in the area in Malaysia, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam.
So interesting is that my observation, and you probably have a lot more depth in this than I do, but is that there have been over Hawaii's, interest in Asia, modern day interest in Asia, a lot of people here in Hawaii who have done business with Japan and China and Korea and all that, or tried to, as the case may be.
Yes.
But it hasn't been a mainstay of our economy. And you don't see a lot of people who have been doing it and around it and all in on it nearly as much as Manny Menedez.
Well, I mean, it hasn't been a walk in the park.
Oh, I'm sure.
I've learned a lot. There's been challenges.
That's kind of euphemistic.
When a country that has been was closed for 30 years comes out, and Deng Xiaoping came up with this fantastic concept: one country, two systems.
He was the great man.
He was the guy who stuck to the philosophy that economic development, opening up the country to the world, was the right thing to do. And there was a lot of people that doubted that. I mean, in the early days of China, there was two currencies. I couldn't trade, renminbi was not tradable. You had to use foreign exchange certificates. There was a lot of challenges going in. But Deng Xiaoping's philosophy of opening up, the opening of China really has worked. And it has taken, it's interesting, if you look at today's statistics, 600 million people, that's twice the population of the United States, has come out of poverty.
The bottom line, which Manny made clear in all his talks, is that we as entrepreneurs can and should do business in China, but that we need to be akamai about the challenges involved.
We were also able to tape his talk at the Plaza Club, presented by Pacific Business News. As in the case of his talk at the Chaminade gathering, the room was packed with people who wanted to know more about Manny's adventures in China.
I thought we'd have a little fun and look back just a few years ago about China. So here's China of yesterday. This is the honor guard that welcomed the United States President Richard Nixon in 1972. This is in Tiananmen Square in the late 1970s. This is a gentleman selling radishes. They're very good, by the way, in Tiananmen Square just before the open door policy. This is Chang'an Avenue, which is like Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is where Tiananmen Square is, the Great Hall of the People, the Forbidden City. This is the main road in Beijing, Chang'an Avenue. You see very little cars, lots of bicycles. This was the colors of China back at that time, which is green, blue. Everyone had Mao type of jackets on and so forth. That's Shanghai in the late 1970s, just a few years ago. This is Shanghai again in the late 1970s, what it looked like, and that's not very long ago. This is a Beijing street not too far from Tiananmen Square. A lot of the Hoteng establishments are there. That sign, by the way, that you see in Chinese basically says Jingchu Mao Zhu Qi Wang Chu Wu Jiang, which means wish Chairman Mao long, long life. And these signs were all over China. So that sign there you could see at many places in China. Then there was a thing called the open door policy. Deng Xiaoping said one country, two systems. It was a profound policy. So socialism and capitalism mixed together in a cocktail, and you have the open door policy. And Deng Xiaoping in 1992 went to Shenzhen, and he said development is an unyielding principle. In other words, the country's going to develop, and that's the direction that the country's going, and they followed that, and it's been amazing, the results in China since that open door policy started. I went just after the door opened up in January 1979, was my first trip to China. This is what Shenzhen looked like in the early 1980s. Shenzhen, when I first went there in 1980, was a fishing village of 20,000, 30,000 people. Shenzhen is contiguous with Hong Kong. This is a sign, many signs in China back then. It says, time is money, efficiency is life. They used to be all over China. You remember, time is money is, I think, one of Benjamin Franklin's favorite quotes. This is actually Shenzhen in 1991, and you can see there in the distance the first McDonald's in China. That's what it looked like. They were tearing down old buildings, and that's the first, actually, McDonald's in China. And then you can see Ronald McDonald. Do we miss it there? Well, I guess the slide's out of order, but you can see a young man and a young woman, which you normally didn't see before the open door policy, out in the public, embracing each other, and a gentleman reading the newspaper on the street. And here's China of today. This is Tiananmen Square. That's the entrance to the Forbidden City. This is Beijing in the evening, a little bit different than what you saw of China yesterday, of yesteryears. This is in Shanghai on the Bund, looking at Pudong. Now, Pudong, when I first went there, was a rice paddy, just all rice fields. That's Pudong of today. And when I say rice fields, that was in the early 1990s. So this happened since the 1990s till now. It's amazing. This is Shenzhen, that fishing village of 20,000 is now 14 million people. So from 1980s till now, that's what Shenzhen looks like. It's an amazing area. This is the high-speed train in China. The Chinese writing on the nose of the high-speed train means harmonious. This is inside the train. They're wonderful. They're on time. They're clean. They work very, very well in China. In fact, if we were building, there's a project in Hawaii. Isn't there a rail project I heard about? Well, if they let the Chinese do it, it would be built in 1 year. And you'd get from Kapolei to downtown Honolulu in 8 minutes. So I wish we would have thought about that. This is the train. I took this. This was at the top speed, but that's going at 300 kilometers an hour. It was getting up to 350, so a couple hundred miles an hour, and it's fantastic. This is in Sanlitun in Beijing, and you can see the colors of green and blue have now changed to multicolors. A very, very modern area. And I could see some folks from Chaminade University. That's one of the areas that you'll be going on this trip this coming year. Okay, let's get into some data. This is the GDP of the world, about 82 trillion. But China and the United States, just put this into context, there's 200 countries of the world, approximately. 2 countries represent 35% of the world's GDP, and that's China and the United States. The other 198 is the balance. Let's look at the U.S. The U.S. is about $18 trillion, and China is about $11 trillion now. So those are the 10 top countries in terms of growth. But if you look at the gaps now, USA 18 trillion in GDP, Japan 4 trillion, or Canada at 1 trillion. There's big gaps now in countries' GDP and the rest of the world. If you take a look at China back in 1990, China was the 11th largest economy in the world. So from 1990, you see in 2010 they jumped to number 2, and then in 2010 through now, they're the number 2 economy of the world. So US and China is number 1 and number 2. Now if you look at the GDP, again, you can see the growth rate here as we look over the years.
If U.S. companies such as Walmart are responsible for the large gap between import and export numbers, to what extent do we contribute to the gap because of U.S. investment dollars in China?
And I can't answer that, but I can tell you that the investment in China is significant, as you saw from the slides. And so that means that those factories that the Chinese have invested in obviously are exporting product outside of China. So there is a correlation. I don't know exactly the emphasis of the correlation, but it's a good point. Yes, the investment in China does have an impact on the exports. Because the number 1 market for cell phones, like iPhones are all made in China, most of them. So all of that manufacturing is done in South China. The number 1 furniture market in the world is China. Number 1 toy market in the world is China, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, the investment has a correlation with exports back to the U.S.
How is the growth of the financial services industry in the rest of the world impacting what's happening in China on a daily basis with folks and their money?
Yeah, great question. I think that there's huge room and opportunity for people in the private wealth area, for example, in banks and other types of investment organizations, you know, Merrill Lynch's and so forth of the world, to get into China and actually start managing the Chinese middle class and money. And that is an unsophisticated market right now. That's why, as I said jokingly but seriously, the stock market is where everybody gambles right now. But now they're afraid with a 40% decline. Everyone's a little nervous about investing in that market right now. So there's an opportunity there, but most people are unsophisticated with that. I'd say that wealthy guys that I know, even upper middle class, are investing mostly in real estate investment because they've seen the greatest returns on buying an apartment, waiting a year or 2, and then flipping it. So, but other kind of financial services and financial products, virgin market, big opportunity, growing opportunity to do that in China and partner with someone.
What's going on in the South China Sea, if you think that there's anything that business owners and people doing business in China can do to kind of support the U.S. interests, or if there's any responsibility you feel that business owners have to support our interests?
Good question and a complicated question. I think there are people in this room that are far more knowledgeable than myself on this. I think U.S. business interests kind of doesn't mix that much or that well with the issues in, for example, the South China Sea. But I'm very confident in our leadership to discuss this and resolve these big question marks in the South China Sea. But I do think the business community needs to be aware of it and understand it a little bit deeper. Some of these things like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, that's not common reading for most folks, but we need to know more about it. So, because it's going to impact. Actually, an interesting statistic was quoted in Washington by Admiral Swift that in the South China Sea, about $60 billion worth of trade goes through the South China Sea. So it's has a huge significant impact directly or indirectly to businesses. So if we can get the data out, maybe U.S. businesses and others can understand it and understand that it's an important concept to make sure that there's freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. And that's been a principle around since actually the 17th century. We shouldn't change that principle now.
Products in China,
Yeah.
then bring it here. Are there signs to do that when you want to ensure the safety of the products and the materials without actually going there?
You can see from his remarks that Manny is fascinated, passionate, and optimistic about China, the evolution of our relationship with China, and the prospects for doing business there. In fact, there's no holding him back.
Manny's optimism is at least a little infectious, and his advice is appealing to any entrepreneur, even in the face of the difficulties he described. Yes, take a chance, Hawaii. See the world. Go to China and yes, do business there. It should be Hawaii's destiny, and it may be yours too.
And now, let's take a look at our ThinkTech calendar of events going forward.
ThinkTech broadcasts its talk shows live on the internet from noon to 5 p.m. on weekday afternoons, and then we broadcast our earlier shows all night long. If you missed a show or want to replay or share any show, they're all archived on demand on YouTube.
Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our weekly calendar and our live stream and YouTube links, or, better yet, to sign on to our email list and get the daily docket of our upcoming shows.
ThinkTech Hawaii has a great new green screen studio at Pioneer Plaza. We invite you to come on down, see our studio, and be a part of our live audience. Contact jay@thinktechhawaii.com. Be a part of our civic engagement on ThinkTech.
Go ahead, give us a thumbs up on YouTube or send us a tweet at ThinkTechHI. We want to know what you're thinking and how you feel about current issues and events affecting Hawaii. We want you to stay in touch with us. We want to stay in touch with you. Let's think together.
On Thursday, January 15th, ThinkTech will join with the Anthology Marketing Group to present a program called Keeping Up with the Jones Act at the Anthology Theater in Bishop Square.
The program will cover the increasingly detrimental effect of the Jones Act on our state's economy and will explore the political positions taken or not taken by our governor, legislature, and congressional delegation.
Join us and raise your awareness about the critical changes affecting and taking place in Hawaii. Be a part of the conversation and sign up to attend on thinktechhawaii.com.
And now, here's this week's ThinkTech commentary.
I've been writing blogs and sending video blogs to the print press since 2008. But this week, a few days ago, I got a letter from them indicating they were effective immediately. They were terminating the, quote, non-staff blogs. It's more than a change in format. They're changing a connection to the public. They're changing access way. You know, if you wanted to have a blog now, presumably you couldn't have one. You want to talk to them, you want to talk to them and have them publish what you have to say. You have to submit that to the letters to the editor page, or you have to see if you can't get an op-ed published. Not that easy. There aren't that many letters to the editor that are actually published. There are not that many op-ed pieces that are actually published. You can submit them all day long and maybe not get published. So the print press, you know, which used to be, you know, an important part of our connection as a community, seems to care less about being connected.
It's a little outrageous that something, they don't pay for space on the internet, on their webpage, and so I'm trying to struggle to come to terms with why they would do something like that, and all I can think of is perhaps they cut back on staff, so they have to edit, or they have to read over, you know, proofread everything before they can put it on, or censor it, or something if it's inappropriate. So perhaps it would be that. I can't imagine why, and it just seems like they're not so concerned with reaching the community or hearing what the community has to say as much as they are the bottom line, perhaps.
But this means something in terms of the intention of the newspaper. It's particularly painful in the case of a newspaper, which is the only print press newspaper really to speak of. And you would want them, you would expect them to recognize a kind of obligation to be completely inclusive. This is not a statement of inclusivity.
Right.
It's just the other way, you know.
Well, perhaps the content was a bit much for them.
What does much mean?
Maybe it was, you know, some interests out there didn't like some of the things that were being said.
With the letters to the editor, they can print it or not print it.
Exactly.
With the op-ed pieces, they can print it or not print. With all of the, you know, the columns and the news stories, they have control over what goes in the paper and what doesn't. But if you have a blog, they have less control. What does it mean for the free flow of information among the members of the community?
It means that we have to support the smaller publications and the smaller stations, and because those are the people who listen more. And so we can still get it out there. It's just going to be a little more challenging.
I think this is the right time, at least for us, to find other ways to express ourselves if that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
I also feel that people should express themselves as much as possible. That's part of the ThinkTech credo. We want to encourage people to send us tweets. We'll talk about that. We want to encourage people to give us commentaries. But the idea for us, anyway, is we want to get into the corners, find the news, and report it fairly. Even if we have our own, you know, preferences about it, report it fairly, and try to teach people things they don't know in this community. I think it's a good model.
It is.
And I don't think there's that much of it, so we're in a good place.
Exactly, especially that we're asking people every week, every time we have a show, please, you know, communicate with us so we can hear what you're thinking, and we'll communicate back, and we can, you know, begin this conversation, which begins the momentum, and that's when changes take effect.
Yeah. So a perfectly negative thing like this letter terminating all the, or most of the non-staff blogs, it actually has a bright side to it.
Exactly. We can get some momentum going with this.
This is the world we live in, and we can't function as a community. We can't reach new levels unless we exchange on issues that are important to the community itself. We all have to be educating ourselves for life. When I finished school, I didn't want more school. I didn't want more education, but I changed my mind completely now. I mean, every day has got to be education. And you don't have to get it in a classroom. You get it in the real world.
Exactly.
This is the real world. We have to educate ourselves. And if people didn't understand this before all the newspapers started to go out of business, they really should understand it now. And when a newspaper cuts back, even a newspaper which is effectively a monopoly newspaper, when that newspaper cuts back, we should have a cold chill about it. And we should look for other ways to be educated, not only for our own individual thought process, but for the community. The question is whether my generation or your generation is going to be drawn by that that kind of brochure look, that kind of,
My
catalog
generation
look.
is. They want everything in 40 characters or less, or 2 minutes or less. If they can't read it and do something else at the same time, then they're not really interested. And there's not this conversation once they read something interesting. It's not like they're like, oh, hey, Jay, can you believe this? And I'm outraged. What are we going to do about this? It's like just another thing, and then they flip to the Kardashian and, it's forgotten a moment later.
Yeah, and so the only people making public statements, in large part, are people with sort of activists.
With a cause.
With a cause. And that's not enough. And so we get a sort of a shrill aspect to what is going on in the nether. I don't know how we fix that, but I don't think the paper is advancing us in any way by removing the non-staff blogs. They're
Especially as
cutting
the
us
only
off.
one,
Yeah.
the only paper
Yeah.
that we have here. And yeah, it's almost like censorship.
In a funny way, that's true. And that's where I'm going to leave this, right there.
We'll be right back to wrap up this week's edition of ThinkTech, but first, we want to thank our underwriters.
Okay, Richard, that wraps up this week's edition of ThinkTech. Remember, you can watch ThinkTech on OC16 several times every week. Can't get enough of it, just like Duke Oishi. For additional times, check out OC16.tv.
For lots more ThinkTech videos and for underwriting and sponsorship opportunities on ThinkTech on OC16, visit thinktechhawaii.com. Be a guest or a volunteer, a producer or an intern, and help us reach and have an impact on Hawaii.
Thanks so much for joining us and for being part of our ThinkTech Ohana and for supporting our open discussion of tech, energy, diversification, and globalism in Hawaii. You can watch this show throughout the week and tune in next Sunday evening for our next important weekly episode. I'm Noina Au.
And I'm Richard Melendez. Aloha, everyone.
That's it.